The text came through at 9:52 on a Tuesday night while I was sitting alone in my workshop sanding the legs of an oak rocking chair I'd been restoring for almost 2 months. Outside, wind pushed hard against the shutters facing Wando Creek, and somewhere past the marsh grass a storm was building slow and low over the water. One word lit up my phone screen. Firefly, then a location pin, my daughter's house. I remember staring at that message long enough for the shop light above my workbench to start humming louder in my ears. Not because I didn't understand what it meant. Because I understood it immediately. 12 minutes later, I was standing in the wind outside Sarah's front door, listening to my 7-year-old granddaughter cry while a man I once genuinely respected shouted inside that house like he owned every frightened soul in it. And somewhere between the sound of that little girl crying and the cold, controlled fury in my son-in-law's voice, I understood something that still keeps me up some nights. This hadn't started tonight. I was just finally arriving in time to see it. The workshop smelled faintly of sawdust, linseed oil, and coffee gone cold. My radio sat on the shelf beside a row of chisels, playing something low through static while wind rattled the metal roof. Most evenings at 65 years old followed the same rhythm. Quiet work with my hands. An early dinner. Maybe a call from Sarah if Emma wanted to tell me about her soccer team or whichever song she'd decided was the best song in the world that week. I lived a simple life by then. At least that's what people assumed. Most of my neighbors knew me as Diane Hargrove, retired widow, owner of too many woodworking tools, and one arthritic beagle named Scout. Only a handful of people still remembered Commander Diane Hargrove. 26 years in naval intelligence, 3 overseas postings, enough classified debriefs to make ordinary small talk feel painfully slow for the rest of my life. Marcus never cared much for my history. Early in his marriage to Sarah, he'd joked once at Thanksgiving that I was America's most terrifying grandmother. Everyone laughed, including me. But over the years, the jokes changed shape. You military types see threats everywhere. You don't have to interrogate every conversation. Sarah gets anxious because you raised her too guarded. Always said with a smile. Always charming enough that pushing back made you feel unreasonable. I called Sarah immediately. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Nothing. My chest tightened hard enough that breathing felt deliberate. Firefly. Sarah hadn't used that word since she was 12. Her father died suddenly of a heart attack the spring before 7th grade. One moment Robert Hargrove was fixing the porch screen door complaining about the Braves bullpen. The next he was on the ground while our daughter screamed for someone to come help him. After the funeral, Sarah became terrified of silence, terrified of empty rooms, terrified that something terrible could happen while nobody noticed in time. One night she asked me a question I never forgot. What if I'm scared and I can't say it out loud? So we made a word. Firefly. It meant, don't explain, don't waste time, just come. And now, 22 years later, my daughter was using it again. I was up and moving before I'd finished thinking. Scout lifted his head from his bed by the door, sensing the shift in the room immediately. It's okay, boy, I lied, and grabbed my keys, a rain jacket, and my phone off the counter in one motion. The road along the creek gleamed black under the streetlights, wipers beating a steady rhythm. I barely registered the radio. My mind kept circling backward through small things I should have paid closer attention to. Sarah canceling Sunday dinners more often. Emma growing unusually quiet whenever Marcus walked into a room. The way Sarah apologized constantly for things that never needed an apology. At Easter, 2 months earlier, Marcus had corrected the way she'd sliced the ham, in front of the whole table. Not loudly. Worse than loudly, calmly, patiently, the way you'd correct a child for misunderstanding something simple. Sarah had laughed too quickly afterward. I remembered her refilling glasses with a hand that wasn't quite steady, while Emma stared down at her plate. At the time, I told myself marriages were complicated. Adults argued. Families carried stress differently. The truth was uglier than that. Sometimes we mistake avoiding conflict for protecting peace. I called Ray Dobbins at a red light near Rivers Avenue. He answered on the second ring, half asleep. Diane, She used the word silence. That woke him up faster than coffee ever could. How bad? I don't know yet. Another pause, then his voice sharpened, old instincts sliding back into place. You heading there now? Yes, I'll meet you close by. Ray retired from the Charleston County Sheriff's Investigative Unit 11 years ago, though men like him never really stop investigating anything. He lived 15 minutes from Sarah's neighborhood and knew enough about our family that he didn't need further explanation. By the time I turned into the Oak Bluff subdivision, rain had started pooling along the curbs. Brick homes lined quiet streets under dripping live oaks, the kind of neighborhood that looks beautiful from a distance. Every lawn trimmed precisely enough to impress strangers who never look closer. Sarah's porch light glowed pale yellow through the wind. Ray's truck sat parked half a block down under a magnolia. He climbed into my passenger seat in jeans, boots, and an old rain jacket zipped to his throat. Armed? He asked quietly. Yes, he nodded once. Then we heard shouting, carrying sharp across the street even through closed windows. Something crashed inside the house. Not long after, Emma started crying. Not loud crying, scared crying. The kind children make when they're trying very hard not to be heard. Ray looked at me carefully. Want me to call it in now? I was still staring at the door when Marcus's voice cut through the wind. You think your mother's coming to save you? I was already out of the truck. We crossed the street fast but controlled. At our age, you don't run unless something is actually dying. Halfway up the walk, I noticed Emma's bicycle lying sideways in the bushes. Children abandon toys when fear interrupts routine. I know that from 30 years of watching people fall apart in careful, quiet ways. I opened the door without knocking. The smell hit me first. Whiskey, something burnt, cold air pouring through a cracked kitchen window. Then the silence. Not true silence. The dangerous kind, the kind that settles right after shouting stops. Sarah stood near the dining table, one arm pressed tight against her ribs. Her hair had come loose from its clip, and there was a thin line of blood at the corner of her mouth. Emma hid behind her mother's legs in foxprint pajamas, clutching a stuffed elephant so tightly one ear had folded sideways. And Marcus stood by the kitchen island, holding a half-empty Scotch glass, like we'd interrupted an ordinary disagreement that had simply gotten a little emotional. His whole face changed when he saw me. Diane, forcing calm into his voice. This isn't what it looks like. Funny thing about liars, most of them reach for exactly the same sentence. Ray stepped in quietly behind me and shut the door against the wind. Water dripped off our jackets onto the hardwood, while somewhere upstairs a smoke detector chirped a low battery warning every 40 seconds. Emma saw me first. Grandma. She ran so fast the stuffed elephant slipped out of her arms. I caught her against my chest. She was shaking hard enough I could feel it through both our clothes. It's okay, sweetheart, I said softly. Children always know when adults are lying. But sometimes they accept it anyway because they need somewhere safe to put their fear. I glanced at Ray. Can you stay with her a minute? Hey there, kiddo, he said gently, crouching down. You think you can help me find some cookies in that kitchen? Emma looked uncertain until Sarah whispered, Go ahead, baby. Only then did she move. Marcus gave a strained little laugh. Everybody's acting like somebody died. Nobody answered him. Sarah still wouldn't look directly at me. That scared me more than the blood on her lip. I'd raised that girl mostly on my own after Robert died. She was stubborn, independent, and even in hard moments she usually held eye contact like she refused to surrender ground emotionally. That night she stared at the floor. Marcus noticed me watching her. She got upset. Things got out of hand. Sarah flinched slightly when he took a step toward her. Tiny movement, barely visible. But intelligence work teaches you something most people never fully learn. Fear has body language, and once you recognize it, you can't unsee it. I'd spent years interviewing service members who lied through panic attacks with perfectly steady voices while their hands shook under conference tables. Sarah was terrified. Marcus either didn't see it, or believed charm could still talk his way past it. She threw a plate at me first, he continued. You know how emotional she gets. I looked around slowly. Broken ceramic near the living room doorway. One dining chair knocked sideways. Something dark staining the kitchen tile by the sink. Wine, maybe, or scotch. And Emma's coloring book open beneath the coffee table, one crayon snapped clean in half. Children stop coloring when adults become dangerous. Diane, Marcus said, softer now. Sarah texted you in the middle of an argument. That's all this is. Finally, Sarah spoke. No, she whispered. Marcus's jaw tightened instantly. The room shifted, not dramatically quietly, like pressure building before glass breaks. He turned toward her with controlled irritation. Sarah, don't start. My stomach went cold. There it was. Not rage. Ownership. I'd seen that tone before. In military tribunals, in broken command structures, in frightened marriages hidden behind respectable holiday cards. The tone men use when they believe someone else's emotions are inconveniencing them publicly. I stepped forward. Did my granddaughter hear you threaten her mother? Marcus blinked. What? You heard me. His expression shifted again, the charm thinning into annoyance. Nobody threatened anybody. From the kitchen, Emma's small voice drifted toward us. Mommy was crying. Nobody moved. Marcus set his glass down hard against the counter. She shouldn't even be up right now. Sarah looked more frightened after he said that. That reaction told me nearly everything. Abuse turns entire households into systems of anticipation. Everyone measuring moods, predicting explosions, managing tension before it arrives, especially the children. I looked at Sarah. Did he hit you? Long pause. She swallowed hard, then looked toward Marcus before answering. That was the moment something inside me quietly broke. Not loudly. Just an understanding settling into place. This had happened before. Sarah, I said carefully. You're making this bigger than it is, Marcus cut in. Ray came out of the kitchen then, Emma holding his hand, clutching 2 cookies wrapped in a paper towel. Even in that moment, seeing those cookies nearly undid me, because decent men instinctively comfort a frightened child, and dangerous men instinctively resent one for exposing the tension in a room. Marcus's eyes flicked sharply toward Ray. Who invited him here? I did, I said. A short, humorless laugh. Right, of course. Back up. Ray ignored him entirely. Police are on their way. Marcus's face flashed toward Sarah. Fear, not guilt. That mattered. Seriously, he snapped. You called the cops? I didn't, she whispered. I did, Ray said calmly. The anger drained out of Marcus's face almost instantly, replaced by exhausted suburban husband mode. This is getting ridiculous. We had an argument. That's all. Men like Marcus survive because they understand performance. Not the screaming kind, the normalcy kind. He walked towards Sarah slowly, hands open, like a man comforting his overwhelmed wife. She leaned back before she caught herself. He noticed. So did I. Then came the knock at the door. 2 Charleston police officers stepped in a few minutes later, carrying Rain in with them. A younger officer named Delgado, and an older woman with tired, careful eyes named Officer Munn. Munn took one look at Sarah's face and separated everyone into different rooms immediately. The standard domestic response. Smart? Woman. While Delgado spoke with Marcus in the living room, Munn guided Sarah gently to the kitchen table. Ma'am, did your husband strike you tonight? Sarah stared down at her hands. Rain tapped the window. Nobody spoke. Then she looked toward Marcus before answering. The smallest shake of his head, almost invisible. Not invisible enough. We both got upset, Sarah whispered. I need a clear answer, Munn said patiently. Sarah's breathing went uneven. Emma moved immediately, wrapping both arms around her mother's waist. That little girl already understood emotional rescue. And I realized this wasn't one terrible night. This was an entire life my daughter had been quietly surviving while the rest of us admired holiday photos and backyard cookouts. Sarah looked at me then, for the first time since I'd arrived, and I swear she looked exactly like she had at 12 standing beside her father's casket. Small, exhausted, trying not to collapse. Mom, she whispered, voice shaking. Please don't leave tonight. Sarah and Emma came home with me just after midnight. Not permanently, not yet. At that point, everyone was still pretending the night might become temporary, if handled carefully enough. The police strongly encouraged separation for the evening, But since Sarah wouldn't press charges, Marcus stayed at the house. Officer Munn gave Sarah a long look on her way out that told me she'd seen this exact situation many times before. Fear rarely leaves in one night, especially when love used to live in the same room as the fear. Emma fell asleep almost instantly in my guest room, still holding the elephant. Ray made grilled cheese nobody touched while Sarah stood motionless at my kitchen counter, staring at the coffee maker like she'd forgotten how it worked. I poured her a cup anyway. She wrapped both hands around it without drinking. The clock over the stove read 1:47 a.m. "You want me to stay?" Ray asked. "No, thank you," Sarah answered before I could. He studied her a moment. "Call if he shows up." Then he squeezed my shoulder on the way out. Once his truck disappeared down the street, the house went quiet again, painfully quiet. Only then did Sarah start crying. No sobbing. Just exhausted tears sliding down her face while she stared into untouched coffee. I moved beside her. "Sweetheart." She covered her mouth like she was embarrassed by the sound of herself breaking. That nearly finished me. Rain ticked softly against the window over the sink. Scout lifted his head from the hallway, sensing the tension but too old now to investigate closely. Finally, Sarah whispered, "Do you think I'm weak?" That question hit harder than anything else that night. Not because of what she asked, because of how long she must have carried it alone before saying it out loud. "You survived something difficult," I said quietly. "That isn't weakness." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "Mom, I stayed." There it was, the shame. Abuse plants shame inside people so deeply they start apologizing for their own suffering. I'd spent enough years around trauma counselors to finally recognize it when it was standing right in front of me. "How long?" I asked softly. She stared at her coffee. "Sarah, how long?" Another long silence. He shoved me the first time after Emma turned 3. Something painful moved through my chest. I turned toward the sink so she wouldn't see my face. Lightning flashed pale over the backyard. "I told myself it was stress," Sarah continued quietly. "Then work pressure, then drinking, then money problems." Excuses, layer after layer. Not because she was foolish, because people in pain cling desperately to the version of someone they first loved. When did it get worse? After his promotion 2 years ago. That tracked. Marcus had always loved appearances. The watch, the gym membership. The networking dinners full of people who used words like leverage in ordinary conversation. At first it looked harmless. Ambition usually does. Then came the smaller things, criticizing her clothes before parties, correcting her stories in front of people, monitoring what she spent, asking who she was texting. Slowly, carefully, taking her confidence apart one piece at a time. "He checked my phone constantly near the end," Sarah said. "Said married people shouldn't have secrets. And you believe that?" She looked embarrassed. "Sometimes. That hurt too. Not because I blamed her. Because smart, capable women get manipulated every single day by men who understand emotional erosion far better than they understand violence. He'd start arguments before family things," she went on. "Then afterward everybody just thought I was tired or emotional." Thanksgiving flashed back with awful clarity. Sarah's shaking hands. Marcus's easy joke about how sensitive she'd gotten. God, the signs had been everywhere. "You should have told me," I whispered before I could stop myself. Sarah stiffened instantly. "There it is. What?" "That look. Like you're disappointed in me." "I'm disappointed in him." But I stayed with him. The kitchen went quiet again. I took both her hands. "Sarah, your father died when you were 12. You spent half your life terrified of losing people. Men like Marcus know exactly how to use that." Her face crumpled at Robert's name. For a second, she looked painfully young again. Then she whispered something that made my blood run cold. "He used Emma's college fund." I stared at her. "What?" She looked physically sick saying it. "He borrowed against it. How much?" She didn't answer right away. The silence told me before the number did. Almost all of it. I sat down slowly because my legs didn't feel steady. That account wasn't just money. It was years, birthdays, consulting contracts I'd taken after leaving the Navy. Every choice to keep driving an older car instead of buying something new. Not because I was wealthy, Because I wanted Emma protected from hardship if I could manage it. He kept saying it was temporary liquidity, Sarah said quietly. The corporate language of that sentence made me nauseous. Not theft, not betrayal, liquidity. He mixed documents together, she went on. Tax forms, refinancing papers. He'd asked me to sign things late at night after arguments. Classic overload manipulation. Exhaust someone emotionally first, then hand them paperwork while they're too drained to read it closely. A knock sounded at the back door around 9 the next morning. Ray stepped in with a tray of coffees and a legal pad thick with notes. "You two eat anything yet?" Neither of us answered. He set the coffees down and looked at Sarah. "You okay if I ask a few questions?" She nodded, hesitant. "I started pulling public records last night," he said. Sarah tensed immediately. "Relax, nothing illegal." He flipped the pad open. "Your husband's spending doesn't match the income he's claiming." I watched Sarah's face tighten slowly. Hotel charges, wire transfers that don't add up, some jewelry purchases. He slid a printed photo across the table. A woman in her late 30s laughing beside Marcus outside a rooftop restaurant downtown. Sarah stared at it like the air had left her lungs. "Who is she?" I asked. "Renata Osi," Ray said. "Married. Runs a commercial leasing firm." Sarah covered her mouth. I thought I was imagining it. Ray glanced at me before pulling another folder from under his arm. "That's not all. Bank summaries. Private consultation invoices. Preliminary divorce paperwork." My stomach turned. Marcus had been planning his exit while draining the family dry the whole time. Sarah looked at the documents for a long moment before saying the saddest sentence I'd heard in years. I kept trying harder. Around noon, a woman with silver-streaked hair stepped onto my porch carrying a leather briefcase, and the calm expression attorneys develop after decades of watching families come apart. Ray introduced her, Farah Nakamura. She reviewed the paperwork for nearly an hour before setting down her glasses. Then she looked directly at Sarah. "Your husband likely committed financial abuse, fraud, and coercive control," she said evenly. "And your daughter still thinks she's the one who failed." Sarah stared down at her hands. Farah's voice softened slightly. "You aren't trapped anymore," she said. "You just haven't realized the door's already open." For the first few days after Sarah and Emma moved in, everything felt careful, not peaceful. Like all three of us were balancing on the same thin glass floor. Nobody wanting to be the one who stepped too hard first. Sarah slept lightly, woke at every unexpected sound. Emma followed her mother from room to room, without seeming to notice she was doing it. Even Scout started lying near their bedroom door at night, the way old dogs sometimes do when they sense wounded people under the same roof. Marcus, meanwhile, became several different men depending on the hour. At 7 a.m., apology texts. "I'm so sorry I lost control. Tell Emma I love her." By afternoon, the shift. "You're humiliating me. Your mother is poisoning this." Families fight Sarah, then guilt. "Emma deserves both parents under one roof, then anger. Nobody else is going to put up with your anxiety forever." That last one nearly sent me straight to his office. Instead, I sat in the shop sanding a bookshelf, trying to remember every lesson the Navy ever taught me about restraint. Discipline matters most when the rage feels justified. Farah came by 3 days later with 2 thick folders. Sarah sat across from her at my table, still wearing one of my old sweatshirts, hair loosely tied back. Exhausted but different. Less frightened, more alert, like someone slowly surfacing after years underwater. "I spoke with a forensic accountant this morning," Farah said. Sarah tensed. "Relax. Not catastrophic, but worse than we first thought." She slid printed spreadsheets across the table. "Marcus has been submitting false reimbursement claims through his firm for at least a year and a half. Hotel charges, restaurant expenses, car services. Thousands of dollars." Sarah went pale. "He told me we were struggling financially. People like Marcus build entire identities around appearances," Farah said. "Once maintaining the image matters more than reality, the ethical lines go fast." Ray tapped one highlighted line. "There's also a leased apartment downtown." Sarah closed her eyes. Not dramatic, just tired. I realized then she'd probably known about the affair long before any proof surfaced. Most spouses do. They spend years negotiating emotionally with evidence they don't want confirmed. When did you first suspect? I asked. About a year ago. Why didn't you confront him? She laughed softly, without humor. I did. He convinced me I was paranoid. Then he bought flowers, booked a trip, acted perfect for 3 weeks. That tracked too. Cruel men rarely stay cruel constantly. If they did, leaving would feel simpler. The dangerous ones understand timing, cruelty, affection, humiliation, apology, repeat, until confusion becomes its own kind of prison. Sometimes I couldn't tell if I was overreacting anymore, Sarah said quietly. That's intentional, Farah said. Coercive partners destabilize confidence gradually. The goal isn't just control, it's dependency. I watched my daughter absorb that, not because it was new information, because hearing someone else name her reality made it harder to keep excusing. Over the following weeks, small changes started happening almost invisibly. Sarah opened her own checking account, changed her passwords, started answering calls from old friends she'd slowly disappeared from over the years. One evening, I heard her laughing on the phone with a former coworker from the school where she used to teach. The sound stopped me cold in the hallway. I honestly couldn't remember the last time I'd heard my daughter laugh like that. Marcus, meanwhile, grew more unpredictable. One night, a crying voicemail. The next morning, an accusation that Sarah was emotionally kidnapping Emma. Flowers on my porch with a handwritten note, I miss my family 2 hours later. A text. You've humiliated me in front of everyone I know. Whiplash like that would exhaust anyone. For someone already traumatized, it becomes disorienting enough to feel physically dangerous. 3 nights later, Marcus showed up unannounced. I saw his car pull into my driveway just before sunset. Sarah froze at the kitchen window, fear moving through her body before thought did. That alone got me to the front door before he reached it. He stood on my porch in an expensive coat despite the humid evening, exhausted but carefully composed. I just want to talk to my wife. She doesn't want to talk tonight. His jaw tightened. You don't get to decide that. Actually, I did. Not permanently. Not legally. But inside my house, absolutely. She's had enough pressure for 1 week. He laughed softly. You know, Diane, the military grandmother thing might work on Sarah. It's not working on me. There it was. That careful arrogance, the assumption that calm women are controllable women. I stepped fully onto the porch, closing the door behind me. You know what your biggest mistake was? Enlighten me. You confused kindness with weakness. For the first time since I'd known him, I watched uncertainty flicker across his face, only briefly. Then the confidence came back. She'll come back, he said. Eventually, she'll realize nobody else is going to put up with all this instability. I looked at him for a long moment. The woman you married survived losing her father at 12, raising a child mostly alone emotionally, and spending years protecting your reputation while you took her confidence apart piece by piece. You don't know everything. No, I said softly, but I know enough. He looked toward the house one more time, then stepped back off the porch. This isn't over. I watched his taillights disappear down the street and realized something quietly important. For the first time since this began, I wasn't afraid of him anymore. 3 weeks later, Marcus Ellison walked into the Low Country Children's Hospital gala, believing his life was still salvageable. That was the tragic thing about men like him. Even as everything collapsed around them, they still assumed charm would eventually reopen the right doors. The gala happened every spring in the grand ballroom at the Charleston Riverside Hotel, overlooking the harbor. Donors, executives, old Charleston families quietly judging each other while pretending not to. Soft jazz under crystal chandeliers, waiters carrying trays of shrimp and grits shooters through conversations polished smooth by money. I hadn't been to one of those events since Robert died. Back then, they still felt like community. Now they felt like theater. Sarah nearly backed out that afternoon while getting ready in my bedroom. I don't want a scene, she admitted quietly, fastening small gold earrings. Farah stood beside her, adjusting the cuff of her navy dress. You aren't creating the scene, she said calmly. You're simply refusing to protect it anymore. Sarah stared at herself in the mirror for a long moment. Then, without a word, she slid her wedding ring off and set it beside my jewelry tray. Small moment. Enormous meaning. By 7, the ballroom was already thick with expensive smiles and strategic conversation. Ray stood near the back bar with a club soda, watching the room the way retired investigators always watch a room. I kept my own look simple. Dark slacks, cream blouse, one silver bracelet Robert bought me overseas 34 years ago. No pins, no medals, no attempt to project anything. Half the people there probably assumed I was somebody's widowed aunt there for the free salmon. Perfect. Marcus arrived 20 minutes later with Renata Osei on his arm. The room noticed immediately. Upper-middle-class Charleston has its own ecosystem around scandal. Everybody sees everything. Nobody says a word until silence becomes socially inconvenient. He spotted us and his expression changed instantly. Not fear. Annoyance. "Well," he said, approaching with a scotch, "didn't expect military grandmother night." I sipped my iced tea calmly. "How's parking downtown these days?" That irritated him because I wasn't playing the emotional game he wanted. He leaned in slightly. "Sarah really shouldn't be here tonight. She's fragile right now." There it was. The setup. Plant doubt publicly before the truth arrives. "My daughter seems clearer than she's been in years," I said. His smile tightened, almost invisibly. "I suppose everyone needs a comforting story." Then he walked away, checking over his shoulder twice. A small crack. Pressure had already started building beneath the surface. Earlier that week, Farah had quietly forwarded the documented reimbursement irregularities to Marcus's firm. No dramatic accusations, just enough inconsistencies to trigger internal review. Separately, Renata's husband had received the evidence of the affair. No sabotage, just the truth moving slowly through the correct channels. Real consequences rarely arrive loudly at first. They spread quietly, like water under a locked door. By 8:15, tension had already shifted through the ballroom in small, visible ways. Conversations paused when Marcus approached. One senior partner from his firm stopped meeting his eyes entirely. Renata noticed too, scanning the room while Marcus drank more heavily, trying to hold on to control of every conversation he touched. Then her husband arrived. Warren Ozzie, tall, composed, in a tuxedo that didn't need to announce anything. He walked straight to his wife. "We need to talk," he said quietly.
The envelope
Renata
she
went
carried.
pale. Marcus
At the
stepped
hearing,
in fast.
my husband was full
"Warren,
of arrogance.
this isn't the place."
"You won't see a dime
Warren
of what I
looked
built,"
at him
he
with
said,
total disgust.
loud enough that the clerk
"You
near
spent
the door
7
looked up
months
from
with
her
my
desk.
wife in
His
company-funded
girlfriend sat
hotel
beside him
rooms.
in a
I
cream-colored
think
blazer.
any place works
Her hands
fine.
folded like
Several
she was
nearby
posing for a photograph
conversations
instead
died
of
at
sitting in a
once.
family courtroom.
That's the thing about public
She should
collapse.
be grateful she lasted this long,
Everyone
she added,
pretends not to
just
stare
quiet
while
enough to
staring
pretend
harder
it was
than ever.
private. Just loud
Across
enough
the
that
ballroom,
everyone
2
heard it
men in
anyway.
dark suits came in through
I didn't
a side
respond.
door. Company
I opened my
investigators
bag, took
right
out a
on
sealed
schedule.
envelope, and set it on
Marcus
the table
saw
in front
them
of my
too.
attorney,
For
who
the
slid
first
it forward
time all
to the
evening,
bench.
real panic
The
crossed
judge
his
opened
face.
it.
"Mr.
He read
Ellison,
the first
we need a
page.
private conversation."
Then he sat back in his
He
chair
laughed
and let
too
out a
loudly.
short, surprised
About
laugh.
What?
The kind of
Expense
laugh that
discrepancies,
escapes before a person can
unauthorized
stop it.
reimbursements.
"Well,"
Nearby
he said,
guests suddenly
"this changes
found their
things.
wine glasses
My husband's
fascinating.
confident expression
Nobody
didn't
defended him.
disappear all at once.
Once respect disappears,
It drained
isolation
slowly.
happens
The
astonishingly
way color
fast.
leaves a photograph
Then
left
Sarah
too long
walked
in the
in.
sun.
The room shifted
His
again.
girlfriend stopped smiling
Simple
entirely.
navy dress, hair
My
pulled
name is
back,
Claire Dawson.
no dramatic
I was
makeup,
44
no
years old the
visible
day my
fear
marriage
anymore.
ended in a courtroom
Just
in front
calm.
of strangers.
And the moment Marcus
And the
saw that
strange
calm,
part is, by
I think
then,
he finally
I wasn't
understood
mourning
he was
the marriage
losing something
anymore.
he couldn't talk
I
his
had
way
already
back
mourned
into.
it weeks
He moved
earlier,
toward her.
alone, in a
"Sarah,
kitchen that used to be
tell them
mine.
this is ridiculous."
What I was doing that morning
She
wasn't
said
grieving.
nothing.
It was
"You've blown
finishing
this
something.
completely out
For
of
21
proportion.
years, I had been
Still
Robert
nothing.
Dawson's wife.
People were openly
Rob,
watching
everyone
now.
called him.
Then he made
except
the
his
mistake
mother,
men
who
like
always
him
used his full
always
name
make
like she was
once
still
panic
deciding whether to be
overtakes
proud of him.
performance.
I
His
met him when
voice
I was
rose.
24.
"Your mother
He was
poisoned
charming
this
in
marriage
that
against
specific
me."
way that doesn't announce
Sarah
itself.
looked at him quietly
The kind
for
of
several
charm
seconds.
that makes you feel like
No
you
anger,
found something
no
rare
tears.
instead of
That
realizing you were
frightened
being
him more
sold
than
something.
either would have.
He was starting
"I
a small
protected
real
you for
estate
years,"
development
she
company
said
back
finally.
then. Just
The
him and
ballroom
one
had
partner
gone
and a
nearly
folding
silent.
table in a rented
"Sarah,
office above
but
a dry
I'm done
cleaner.
doing that now."
I was a
Simple
physical
sentence.
therapist. 3 years
Devastating
into a
sentence.
job I
Marcus
loved,
looked at me then,
working with
not
patients
furious
recovering
anymore.
from strokes and
Desperate.
surgeries and car accidents.
Like maybe some other
We
adult
didn't
in the
have
room
money.
would still
We
rescue
had a
him
used
if
Honda
he
with a check
explained
engine
himself
light that
correctly
never
enough.
turned off,
I said
and
nothing.
we had each other.
Security
and for a long
had already
time that
started
felt like
drifting
more than
closer
enough.
alongside
His business
the
grew the way
investigators.
businesses grow when someone
Mr.
is
Ellison,
patient and a little bit
we
ruthless.
need you to come with us.
The folding table
He tried
became a
once
real
more.
office.
This is
The
because
one
of her,
partner
he
became a
snapped,
staff of
pointing at
30.
me. She never
People
liked
stopped
me.
saying Rob's
Nobody
little
answered.
company
Not
and
even
started
Renata.
saying Dawson
As security
Development,
walked him
like it
toward
was a
the
fact
exit,
of the landscape,
he kept glancing
like it had
back
always been
like
there.
the room itself had
I kept
betrayed
doing
him.
what I did.
But the truth was
I
simpler.
liked my work.
His lies had
I liked
finally
the
run
quiet,
out of
specific
places to stand.
satisfaction of watching
Sarah
someone
exhaled
regain the
slowly
ability to
beside me
climb
once
stairs,
the doors closed.
or hold a coffee
Not
cup,
relief, exactly.
or walk their daughter down
Something
an aisle.
quieter.
Rob used
You
to tell
okay?
people that
I
my job
asked.
was the real one.
She looked
that
across
his
the
was just
ballroom
moving
where
numbers around.
conversations had already
He
begun
stopped saying that
restarting in
around year
careful
15.
whispers.
I noticed the
I
year
think
it stopped.
this is the first
I
time
just didn't
in
understand
years
yet what
I've
it meant.
stopped being
Success
afraid
didn't
of him.
change him overnight.
4 months
It changed
after
him
the
the way
gala,
water changes
I
stone.
stood barefoot in my
Slowly
kitchen,
enough that you
making
can't point to
blueberry
the day it
pancakes
happened.
while Emma sat
Only
at
to
the
the
counter
fact that one day
explaining,
you look and
with
the shape
total
is
conviction
different.
and
He
several
started
logical
speaking to
gaps,
waiters differently.
why
He started
octopuses
speaking
were
to me
smarter than
differently.
dolphins.
Somewhere
The
in there,
morning
I stopped
sun
being his
came through the
partner and
windows
became
in
something
clean
closer
yellow
to a
stripes
fixture in
across
his
the
life.
tile.
A chair he'd
Scout
owned
lay
for
by
2
the fridge,
decades and no
pretending
longer
to
noticed
sleep
sitting
while
in.
waiting for someone to
I
drop
tried to
bacon.
fix it. I want to
Saturday
say that
mornings
clearly
had
because
become
I
our
think
thing.
women in my position often get
Pancakes.
asked later
Cartoons
why they
playing
didn't
low
try
in the
harder,
other room.
as if
Emma
trying harder
stealing
was ever the
chocolate
problem.
chips when she thought
We went
I
to
wasn't
counseling
looking.
for a year.
Sarah
We took a trip
sleeping
to
a little
Portugal
later
that
than
I'd hoped
usual
would remind us
because
of who we
rest
used
had
to
finally
be.
started
I softened
finding its way
arguments I
back
didn't need
into
to
her
soften.
body.
I
That
forgave
moved me
things
more
that
than I
maybe didn't need
expected.
forgiving,
For
and
years,
other
my
things
daughter
that
had looked
absolutely
awake
did.
but not rested.
None of it worked,
Present,
because
but
repair
not
takes
settled.
2 people.
Like part of
and
her
I was the only
always
one
listening
holding
for
the tools.
footsteps in
The
another
first
room.
sign of Nicole
Some
came about a
mornings
year
now,
before the hearing.
She slept straight through the
Rob
garbage
started
truck
sleeping
outside.
with his phone
Sarah
face
walked
down on
in
the
wearing gray
nightstand,
sweatpants
something he'd
and one
never
of my
done
old
before.
navy hoodies.
He picked up
hair
projects in
loosely
Colorado
knotted.
Springs that never
Morning.
showed up on the company
There was
calendar
color
I
in her
still
face
had
again,
access to.
not glamorous.
He bought a watch
Just
I never
alive.
saw him wear.
Coffee?
When I asked
Please.
about any of
She
it, he
leaned
got
against the
defensive
counter,
fast.
watching Emma press
The particular
too much
kind of
purple crayon
defensive that
onto an
people get when the
octopus.
question lands
Therapy,
closer to the
though
truth
okay
than they
yesterday?
expected.
I asked.
I found
Hard.
out her name 3
But
months
okay.
later.
That was usually
Nicole
how she
Ferris,
described it.
31.
I'd learned
A
not
junior
to push for
associate
more
at a
unless
marketing
she
firm
offered
his
it.
company used
The
for
legal
branding.
mess around Marcus
I didn't
moved
find out
slower
by
than
confronting
television
him.
makes it look.
I found
No
out the way
single
these things
satisfying
usually get
courtroom
found
moment.
out, which is
Just
to say,
paperwork,
almost by
delays,
accident.
small,
Except I've come to
humiliating
believe there's no
truths
such
repeated
thing as
in sterile
accident in these
conference rooms.
situations.
His firm
There's just a
terminated
truth
him
that's
quietly
tired of waiting.
after the
I'd
audit
left a late
confirmed
shift at the
falsified
clinic and taken a
reimbursements.
different route home
Warren
because of
filed for
construction
divorce
on my
from
usual
Renata
road.
within weeks.
I passed a
Sarah
wine bar
pushed
I'd
hard
never
on
been
the
to, and
financial
I saw his
recovery,
car.
on custody
I
protections,
told myself it could be a client
on
dinner.
documenting the coercive
Then I saw them
pattern
through
for
the window,
record.
her
Sarah
hand resting on
focused
his
smaller
forearm,
things.
him laughing in a way
Opening
I
mail
hadn't heard
without her
directed at
hands
me in
shaking.
years.
Driving Emma to
I
school
stood on the
alone,
sidewalk for maybe
buying
20
a dress
seconds.
because she liked it.
Then I walked
not
back to my
because
car and
Marcus
drove
would
home in
approve.
complete silence.
Small victories nobody
I didn't
applauds,
scream.
but
I
the
didn't
kind
confront him
put
that
a
night
person
or
back
the next.
inside her own life.
I gathered
one
myself
decision
first,
at a time.
the way you gather
One
yourself
afternoon
before
in
doing
late
something
spring,
that matters.
I found her
When
standing
I finally
in the
asked
guest
him
room
directly
doorway,
2 weeks
holding
later,
a framed
he
photo
didn't deny
from 2
it.
Christmases
He looked
earlier.
almost relieved to
Marcus
stop pretending.
smiling broadly.
Maybe
one
this is
arm
the
around
wake-up call
Sarah,
we both needed,
one hand
he
on
said.
Emma's shoulder.
And I remember
Sarah looked
thinking that
beautiful
after
in it
21
at first
years,
glance.
that was the
But
sentence
once you knew
he'd
what
chosen.
to look for, the
Not an
photo
apology.
changed.
A
Her shoulders
slogan.
too tight.
He filed for
Emma
divorce
leaning
11
subtly
days
away.
later.
Sarah's
And that was when the
hand
version
gripping
of
her
Rob
own
I'd
wrist
married
hard enough
disappeared
to
completely,
whiten the knuckles.
replaced by someone I
hate
didn't
that
recognize.
picture, she said
Cold
quietly.
in meetings, quick to
Then don't
anger,
keep it.
surrounded by attorneys
She
who
looked at
spoke
me
about our
like the
life
thought
together
hadn't
like it
occurred
was
to
a
her.
portfolio to be
A
liquidated.
minute later, she walked outside
The financial
and dropped the
disclosures were
frame
where
into the
things
trash
stopped
bin by
making
the shop.
sense.
No speech,
Rob's reported
no
income
tears.
was less than
Just
half of what I
glass
knew
and
our
wood
household
hitting
actually
plastic
brought
with
in.
a dull thud.
Accounts
Healing
I remembered
arrives like
clearly
that
weren't
sometimes.
listed. When my
Quiet,
attorney raised the
almost rude.
discrepancies,
A few
his
weeks
legal
after
team
the
called
gala,
them
Sarah
administrative
picked up
oversights,
part-time work in an
the kind of
after-school
phrase
art
designed to make
program
a
on
person
James
feel
Island.
foolish for
Nothing
noticing.
prestigious.
I wanted
3
to accept that
afternoons a week
explanation.
helping kids
It would have been
paint
so much
lopsided
easier to
birds
accept
and
it.
clay bowls no
But
parent
something
could
underneath
identify
the numbers
without help.
felt deliberate.
The first
And that
day,
feeling
she
didn't
came home
fade.
with blue paint
It
on her
grew.
wrist and a
Back
real
in the
smile
courtroom,
on
the
her
judge
face.
kept reading.
I walked
His
into the
amusement
shop
had turned into
afterward
something
and cried
sharper,
for 10
more
straight
focused.
minutes where nobody
Rob
could
shifted
see
in
me.
his seat in a way I
Not because
recognized from
everything
21
was
years of
fixed.
watching him get uncomfortable
It
at dinner
wasn't,
parties
because
when a
something
conversation
inside
went
her
somewhere
had
he
started
didn't
moving
control.
forward again.
Nicole's
that mattered
posture
more
had
than
gone
any
rigid.
satisfaction
My attorney
I might
glanced
have
at me
taken
once,
from
and I kept
watching
my face
Marcus
still,
lose things.
because months earlier
And for
this
a while,
moment would have
I
terrified
did
me.
feel that satisfaction.
Now I was simply
watching
his
his job
happen.
disappear.
The
His
judge
image
set the letter
crumble,
down and looked
the
at my husband
admiration
directly.
he'd polished for years,
Mr. Dawson,
finally
he
tarnished
said,
in public.
I think we're
I
going
won't
to need to
pretend
talk about a few
otherwise.
things.
But it didn't last
That
as long
sentence
as
hung
I
in the room
expected.
for a long moment
What
before
stayed
anyone
longer
moved.
was guilt.
Rob's attorney
I kept
recovered
replaying
first,
old moments with
offering the
cruel
kind
new
of
clarity.
smooth reassurance
Sarah
attorneys are
canceling
trained to
family
produce on
visits.
command.
Emma refusing
Of course, Your
sleepovers.
Honor. We're happy
Marcus
to clarify
speaking to my
anything the
daughter
court
in that
needs.
calm,
The judge only
cutting
said,
tone while
"I'm
everyone
sure
else
you are,"
pretended not to
in a
notice.
tone that made the
I had
phrase sound like a
mistaken
warning
discomfort
rather
for
than an
privacy.
agreement.
I had let politeness
The
delay
hearing
concern.
continued, but the
One
air in the
evening,
room had
sitting
shifted,
on the porch watching
and everyone
rain
felt
move
it.
over the marsh,
The way you
I
feel a
finally
change in
said it.
weather before the
I
sky
should have
actually
pushed
does
harder.
anything.
She didn't
The
answer
judge
right
ordered
away.
supplemental discovery
You did see
connected to
parts of
several
it, she finally
transactions
said.
referenced in my
Not
letter,
enough.
and adjourned
you saw
for the
what
day.
I let you see.
There were
That
no
hurt,
handcuffs,
because it was
no
true.
headline moment.
Abuse turns
Just
families
Rob
into
walking
careful
out of the
stage
courthouse
productions.
without the smile
Everyone
he'd worn
learns a
walking
role.
in.
Sarah's had been
That
keeping
night,
the peace.
alone in the apartment I'd been
Marcus's
renting
had
for
been
4 months,
controlling the room.
I watched
Emma's
rain
had been
slide down a
staying
window
small.
that didn't belong
Mine,
to a
I
house
suppose,
with
had
21
been
years of
respecting
memory
boundaries
behind it.
until boundaries became
The furniture
walls.
didn't match.
I'm sorry.
Half the boxes
I said.
were still taped
Sarah
shut.
reached over
But
and
the
took my
quiet
hand.
in that
I
apartment
know.
was an honest
That was
quiet.
all.
And
Sometimes
after a year of being
forgiveness
lied
doesn't
to,
arrive as a
honesty,
grand release.
even lonely
Sometimes
honesty,
it's just two
felt
words
like solid
and a hand
ground.
staying where
My
it
phone
is.
buzzed. A
By
text from
late
my
summer,
attorney, Diane
Emma
Whitfield.
started sleeping with her
Judge
bedroom
wants
door open
supplemental
instead
records
of
by
closed.
Friday. Call me tomorrow.
Sarah noticed before I did.
Supplemental records.
She says
that was
she likes
exactly the
hearing
phrase
house,
Rob had spent
she
a
told
year
me one
trying to
morning.
avoid.
I nodded
and it
like
traced
that
back
didn't
to the
nearly
same
undo
window
me.
of time
The house
over
had
and
sounds
over.
worth trusting now.
The months after
Coffee
Nicole
brewing
entered his
before
life.
sunrise.
To understand
Scout
how I got to that
snoring in the
envelope,
hallway.
you have to
Emma
go back
humming
9
while
months,
brushing her teeth.
to when I was still
Sarah
trying to save a
laughing
marriage
softly
I
at
didn't
something
yet
on her
know was
phone.
already gone.
Real peace.
Looking back,
Not
it's
silence
strange how
covering
long you
pain.
can talk yourself
Not
out of a
everyone
truth
walking
that's
carefully
standing
around
directly
one
in
man's
front of you.
temper. Just
You don't
peace.
wake up one day and
For the
decide
first
the
time in
person you
years,
married for 2
my
decades
daughter
is a
and
stranger.
granddaughter weren't surviving
You look for
a
other
home.
explanations first.
They were living in one.
Stress,
Marcus
overwork,
called one
a
last
midlife
time
crisis
near the
that will
end
burn
of that
itself
summer.
out.
Blocked
Rob understood that
number. I
instinct
answered
better than
without
I did.
thinking.
And for a
Standing on the
while,
back
he used
porch,
it without
trimming a
either of us
hibiscus,
fully admitting
assuming
what was
it was
happening.
the pharmacy
The late
or
nights
Emma's
started
school.
as closing
Diane?
meetings. Then
His
they
voice
became
sounded
overnight
smaller than
trips
I
to sites
remembered.
2 hours
Not
away that
dramatically
somehow
broken.
never needed him there
Just
before.
worn down, stripped
His
of
explanations
polish,
were always
like a man
plausible
who'd
on their
spent
own.
months discovering
Development
charm
projects run
only
behind.
works on people
Investors
still
need
willing to be
hand-holding.
charmed.
I
didn't
understood
say
that
anything at
world.
first.
I'd watched him build it from
Across
a folding
the yard,
table.
Emma
But
rode her
something
bike
about
in
the way he
uneven
explained
circles
things
while
had
Sarah
started to
sat
feel
on the steps
rehearsed,
pretending to
delivered
read.
a beat too quickly.
Watching her daughter
like
more
a
than
line
the
practiced
page,
in a car on
smiling
the way
every
home.
time Emma corrected her own
One
balance
evening at
without
dinner,
help.
I asked a
One
small,
of Sarah's new
ordinary
habits.
question.
Noticing
Which
small
site was he flying
recoveries.
to on Thursday?
You still there?
He
Marcus
hesitated,
asked.
just barely.
I'm here.
The way a person
I need to
hesitates
talk
when they're
to Sarah.
deciding which
A
lie
long
to tell,
silence followed.
rather than recalling
The
a
old
fact.
Marcus would have filled it immediately.
Colorado Springs,
arguing,
he said,
explaining,
then changed the
accusing,
subject before I could ask a
reframing
follow-up.
until the whole conversation
People who
became
are
a
telling the
maze
truth
built
don't
around
need a
his own
half second to
feelings.
remember where they're
This
going.
one just
I
breathed
filed
into
that
the
away
phone.
without fully
I
understanding
lost
why
everything,
it mattered yet.
he said
A few weeks
finally.
after that, I found
I
a
looked
charge
past
on our
the
joint
porch railing
statement from a
toward the
boutique
creek.
hotel downtown.
Afternoon light glittering on the water.
$900. On a night he'd told me he was home working
in the
late.
reeds like some
He barely
old
looked
judge
at it when I
waiting
asked.
on a confession.
Client dinner
You
ran
lost
long,
what you
booked a
used,
room
I
instead of
said.
driving back
That's
exhausted.
not fair.
He said,
No,
like it was
I answered.
obvious.
What you did wasn't fair.
$900
He
for a
laughed
room he
once,
supposedly
no humor
didn't
in it.
need.
You
I let
always
it go.
thought you were better than me.
Then another charge appeared
No,
the
Marcus,
next month.
I thought you
then
were
another.
family. That
Spa
silenced
visits.
him.
Restaurant
For a
tabs
second,
with
I
numbers
remembered the
too
younger
large for
man
a
he
business
used to be.
lunch. None
The
of
one
it had
who'd
anything
brought
to do
Sarah
with
soup
development
when
deals.
she had the flu,
and all of it
who
had
stayed
something
up
to do
all
with
night
someone
in
I
the
hadn't
NICU
met yet.
after
The
Emma
night
was
I
born
finally saw
early,
them together,
holding that
I'd
tiny
worked a
baby-like
12-hour shift
prayer
and taken a
had weight.
detour to avoid a
Remembering
traffic
that my
backup.
daughter had chosen
That
someone I
detour
once
is the reason
believed
I
was
know now
steady
that some
still
truths
hurt.
find you
Because
specifically
people rarely become
on the one night
monsters
you
all
happen
at
to look
once.
up.
Sometimes
I
they
saw
get
his
smaller
car outside
first,
a wine bar I didn't
meaner,
recognize.
hungrier
And through the
for
window, I
admiration,
saw the two of them,
angrier at
comfortable
anyone
in a
who
way that
reflects
told me
their own
instantly
failure
this
back at
wasn't
them.
new.
I loved
His hand
her, he
rested
said.
over hers on the
Maybe that
table,
was true.
casual,
That's the
practiced,
complicated part
the gesture
nobody
of two
wants in
people who had
stories
done
like
this many times before.
Sometimes people cause
That was the
terrible
detail
damage
that
to
hurt
someone
worse than
they
anything
genuinely
else.
believe they
Not
love.
the affair itself,
But belief
the
doesn't
evidence of
repair
routine.
bruises.
I
It
didn't
doesn't
go in.
refill a stolen
I didn't
account.
call his name.
It
I
doesn't give a
I stood on the
child back
sidewalk
the
for
years
20
she spent
seconds,
listening
then
for
turned around and
footsteps.
drove home in
You
silence.
probably did.
And I cried
said.
later,
Then why are you
alone,
doing this?
where it belonged.
I'm
For the
not
weeks
doing
after that,
anything now.
I paid
You
closer
turned her
attention.
against me.
Not out of a desire
No,
for revenge,
I said calmly.
but because
You
once
taught her
know
to
a
be
truth
afraid of you.
exists,
I just
you can't
helped her
stop your
remember
mind
she
from
didn't
reaching
have to
for the
stay
rest
that
of it.
way.
I noticed
Another
him
silence,
smiling at
longer
texts
this
he
time.
angled away from
Then,
me.
quieter.
I noticed how quickly
Can
a
you at
normal
least tell
question
Emma
could make
I'm
him
sorry?
irritable.
I watched Emma
One
wobble,
evening, through a sliding
straighten,
door he hadn't
keep
closed
pedaling.
all the way,
Sarah
I heard him
clapped from
laugh.
the steps.
A
and
warm,
Emma
easy
grinned
laugh
like
I hadn't
she'd
heard
won
aimed in my
something
direction in
enormous.
years.
She's 7,
And then I heard him
said.
say,
She doesn't
miss
need
you
an
too,
apology carried
in a
to
voice
her
reserved
second
for
hand.
someone he loved.
She needs you to become
I lay
the
awake
kind
that
of
night
man
next
who
to a man who was
understands
either
why she
asleep
needed
or
safety
pretending to
from you.
be.
He said
And
nothing.
I understood
For
clearly
once,
and
there was
calmly
nowhere for his
that the
words to
marriage
go.
had already ended.
Finally, he whispered,
The paperwork
"I
simply
don't know
hadn't
how to
caught up
fix
to the
this."
fact yet. 2
That
weeks
was the
later,
most
I asked him
honest thing
directly.
I'd ever heard
Not
him
as an
say.
accusation,
I looked
just
at
a
Sarah.
question.
She must
Who
have
is
felt
she?
my eyes on her.
He didn't deny
because
it.
she glanced
He
up.
didn't even look
Her
surprised
face
that I
changed
knew.
when she saw the phone
He
at
just
my
said
ear.
her name,
Not
Nicole.
panic.
And when I asked
covered
how
the
long, he
receiver.
said, about
It's
8 months.
him.
Like it was
She
a length
looked
of
at Emma,
employment
then
rather
the
than a
water, then
betrayal
back at
measured in
me.
the years I'd
After
given
a
him.
moment, she shook her
The
head.
divorce filing
Diane
came
covered
shortly
the phone.
after. What I
She
didn't
doesn't
know
want to
yet was
talk.
that the affair
He
wasn't the
breathed
deepest
out
thing he'd
slowly.
been hiding.
Tell her
Not even
I loved
close.
her. No,
The
I said.
$80,000 transfer
That's something
surfaced
you'll have
almost
to
by
say for
accident.
yourself.
3
Someday,
weeks
if
into
you ever
reviewing
become
financial
someone worth
disclosures for
listening
the
to.
divorce.
Then I hung up.
I was
My
cross-referencing
hands
an
were
old joint
steadier than I
investment account
expected.
against the
Sarah
numbers his
came up
attorneys had
beside me
submitted,
a minute later.
and the balance
What
didn't
did he
match.
say? I
Not
told
by
her
a
most
little.
of it.
By
Not all of it.
$81,400,
Some things don't need to be
moved
passed
out 8
along
months
just
earlier.
because they were spoken.
Right around the
She
time I would
listened,
later
arms folded
realize
loosely,
that Nicole
and when I
entered the
finished,
picture.
she nodded
I checked the
once.
transaction
I
3
don't hate him
times,
anymore,
certain
she
I was
said.
misreading a
That
decimal
surprised
point.
me.
I wasn't.
She saw it and
the money
smiled
had left an
faintly.
account I had
I don't
signing
forgive him
authority
either,
on,
she
and I
added.
had never signed
I just
anything.
don't want to carry him
I
around
called Diane
every day.
first thing the next morning.
I looked at my
She
daughter
listened
for a
without
long
interrupting,
moment.
the way good
There are
attorneys
times
do
your
when they
children
already
become
sense a
adults
case
in
is
front
about
of
to
you
become
all
bigger than
over
the
again.
client understands.
Not because they get
Send
older,
me everything you have,
but because
she
they
said.
choose peace
I
over
did.
proof.
An
Distance
hour
over
later, she
drama,
called back.
a future over
Claire,
the
she
exhausting
said,
need to make
don't
someone
confront him about
understand
this.
the damage they caused.
Something in her tone
That
made my
sounds
stomach
healthy,
tighten.
I said.
I wasn't
She
planning
laughed
to.
softly.
Good.
Don't sound so shocked.
Because if there's one hidden transfer,
that evening,
she said,
Emma and
there
I
are usually
sat on
more.
the dock
She was
eating
right.
melting orange
Over the
popsicles
following
while
weeks,
the
my
sun
evenings
dropped
settled
behind
into
the
a
marsh.
routine. A shift
Sarah
at the clinic,
had gone inside
a quiet
to take
dinner,
a call from
then
Farah
hours at my
about the
kitchen
final
table with
custody
bank
agreement.
statements,
The air
tax
smelled
filings,
like cut
and business
grass and
records spread out like a
gasoline
puzzle
from a boat
nobody wanted
somewhere
me to
down the
finish.
creek.
At
Emma
first,
kicked
the
her
numbers
heels
seemed
against the
scattered and
dockboards.
meaningless.
Grandma,
Then patterns
yes,
started to
baby.
surface.
Were you a
the way
hero
they
in
always
the
do
Navy?
once you know to look for
26
them.
years
The
in
timing
uniform
was the first
teaches
thing
you a
I
lot of
noticed.
things,
Most
but
of
not
the
how to
unusual
answer a
transfers
child who
began
believes
within a
rescue
month
and
of Nicole
heroism are the
appearing in
same
his
thing.
life. The
No,
frequency
I
was
said
the
finally.
second thing.
Not the way you
Small,
mean.
recurring withdrawals.
She frowned.
Almost
But
monthly.
Mom says you
structured
saved
to
us.
stay
A
just under
breeze
the
moved
threshold
over
that
the
might
water.
trigger a bank's
Somewhere
automatic
behind
reporting.
us, Scout barked
The third
once at
thing was the
nothing at
part
all.
that made my hands
I thought
go
about
cold.
Firefly,
Several transfers
about
were
Sarah's
routed through
shaking
companies
hands
I
around
had
a
never
coffee
heard
mug,
of.
about a
Despite
little bicycle
21 years
tipped
of
over in
knowing
the
Rob's
rain,
vendors,
about
his
every sign
contractors,
I'd missed
his
because
usual
asking
business
harder
partners by
questions
name.
had felt intrusive
These names
at
were
the time.
different. Ashford
Heroes
Capital
aren't
Group,
always brave
Bright
people,
Line Ventures.
I told her.
Names that sounded
Sometimes they're
polished
just
and
people who
forgettable at
show
the
up
same
when
time.
somebody scared
Like they'd
asks
been
them to.
generated specifically to blend into a
very
spreadsheet without
seriously,
anyone asking
then
a second
nodded,
question.
like I'd
A
handed
search of
her
state
something
business
important.
registries turned up
That
nothing for
night,
either
after
company where
everyone
they
was
were
asleep,
supposed to be filed.
I sat alone on the
Nothing
back
at all.
porch with
That
one
was when the
last
feeling
cup
returned.
of coffee cooling
The
beside
same feeling from the
house
sidewalk
behind
outside the
me
wine
was
bar.
quiet,
The
but
sense
not
that the
kind of
truth was
quiet that
standing right
hides
in front
pain.
of me, and I
This
simply
quiet
hadn't
felt
turned to face
earned.
all of it yet.
If this story
The
stays
following
with you,
week, Diane
I
told
hope
me
it
she wanted me
reminds
to
you
meet
pay
someone.
attention when
A
someone
former
you love
bookkeeper
starts
from Rob's
quietly
company, she said.
disappearing into
A
themselves.
woman named Helen
Ask
Voss,
the harder question.
63 years old,
Make the
careful
call.
and precise
Show
in
up
the way
before
people
silence
become after
becomes the
decades
only
of
way
making
they
sure
know how to
numbers
survive.
reconcile to the penny.
And if you've ever
We
had
met
to
at a
start
diner
over
near the
quietly,
courthouse.
or if someone
Helen
once
ordered
showed up
tea
for
and
you
didn't touch it.
exactly when you needed
You
them,
found some strange
tell us in
transfers,
the comments.
she said.
Let
It
us
wasn't a
know where
question.
you're watching from
I nodded.
tonight.
I wondered
Subscribe
when
so you
someone
don't
finally
miss the next
would,
story.
she said.
Because
And the sentence
sometimes
sent a small
the
chill
stories
through
that
me.
hurt
For
the
the next
most
half
are
hour,
also the ones
Helen
that remind us we were never alone.